Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You'll hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Some researchers write about rural life from a distance, but Dr. Catharine Biddle rolls up her sleeve and works alongside the people who make it. Kat is an associate professor of educational leadership at the University of Maine and a member of the National Rural Education Association's Research Committee. Her through line is simple and powerful. Strengthen rural schools by strengthening the web around them, including youth voice, community partnerships, mental health supports, and teacher pipelines that actually fit the realities of place. Today, we're digging into what Kat and her colleagues are learning across Maine and why young people stay or go, how districts turn research into decisions, what it really takes to redesign small schools without losing community identity, and the partnerships that turn libraries and clinics and local employers into co-educators. We'll also talk about where the research field needs to head next and how leaders can co-design studies that solve real problems on the ground. So if you care about evidence that's useful on school campuses and partnerships that last past the grant cycle, this is your episode. So let's get to it. Kat, welcome. Thanks for being here with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa. This is such a pleasure.
Well, I just want to dive right in because there's a lot of things that we can talk about. You've done a lot with your research and your time with education in rural places and Maine. And I want to start with kind of an overarching question about your through line. What is the thread really that connects your work on school community partnerships and youth voice and then rural vitality across Maine?
Well, I think that to have robust, thriving local communities, you have to have communities that listen to every single resident. And that includes young people. That includes, folks who we don't typically tend to listen to. Maybe they aren't speaking with the loudest voice, or maybe they don't always have the clearest message, but their perspective is really important in terms of the design of responsive systems. And so that's, I think, where the heart of my work lies, is like, how do we get schools and communities to be more responsive systems to the people that live there in the context of all the different global pressures that rural communities are dealing with.
Was there a moment, Kat, that kind of shifted your research agenda in that direction?
Yeah, there absolutely was, actually. So I was in graduate school, and I'd always been, my background is as an educator. I worked in after-school programs. I worked for international nonprofit. I always thought it was really important to listen to kids, but I also came up in my own sort of teaching background and preparation in the kind of no excuses time. And I think that there was a lot of harm done in the kind of way that was implemented, this idea that we've got, kids have just got to show up and buckle down, be gritty, and overcome their circumstances through sheer force of will. And one of the things that really changed my perspective on that was I was in grad school, I was getting ready to do my dissertation, and I was really focused on the impact that Marcellus Shale gas play development was having on the opportunities for young people in rural Pennsylvania. And if you don't know anything about the natural gas industry, it's like a really interesting and powerful industry that has a very ambivalent relationship with most rural communities. In the sense that it can provide a lot of economic opportunity, but a lot of the opportunities aren't necessarily local. It's really hard work. Kids who get into it may get paid really well without a lot of education, but they get moved around. And so as I watched communities try to self-determine in the face of these companies that had really, really deep pockets, I kept getting more and more depressed about like rural communities' chances when it comes to like taking on major industries, or, determining what was going to be best for them and like what a locally thriving vision of rural community resilience looked like. But at the same time that was happening, I got involved in a project doing an evaluation of a program in New England called Up for Learning. And their whole focus is on engaging young people as partners in rural school redesign. And it was such hopeful, exciting work. And the young people that I was talking to were so engaged and so passionate about school reform that really served their peers, that was equitable, that reached all different kinds of kids. And so I thought, if I want to get through my dissertation, which I did, I need to focus on something that's going to bring me hope and make me want to get out of bed in the morning. And so that's how I came to Youth Voice. It was so different from what I had both implemented myself and been trained in as an educator, this idea that we have to listen to kids and not just listen to them, like give them structured choice, but really understand their desires and trajectories when it comes to shaping school.
So important. If rural leaders remember one idea from you about rural improvement, which is what you're talking about, what would that be?
I think one of the things that we have to do as educators all the time is draw lines around our work, right? This is what I can control. This is what I can't control. And that's how you stay sane, right? That's how you go home and sleep at night, knowing that kids are bringing stuff to school that you can't control, that the world is the way that it is, and that in the midst of that, you're trying to get this kid to progress academically in these different kinds of ways, or see this kid grow in this particular kind of way. And the thing that I would say to school leaders and to community leaders is, like, in order to do the kind of like generative rural school redesign work that needs to happen for the 21st century, we have to stop drawing such sharp boundaries around our work and start thinking about the place that it has in the local ecology and building that regenerative ecology that we need to really build up rural communities. So I guess that would be like the one takeaway.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me to my next question. I want to talk about the Rural Vitality Lab, which really moves science to practice. So can you talk, Kat, a little bit about the problems that the Rural Vitality Lab is tackling right now? And how are you translating the findings that you're coming across into district decisions?
Well, so the Rural Vitality Lab was originally founded to kind of hold a partnership that started in 2016 between a set of communities, a nonprofit organization, and two institutions of higher education, so Maine and Colby College. And there was a community organization in northern, sort of eastern Maine that was convening organizations and people to have conversations about adverse childhood experiences and really look at, like, what could local organizations and educators do to reconfigure the support systems that existed for kids in that particular county to better support and prevent adverse childhood experiences. And so that project and series of conversations turned into a research practice partnership that spanned 2016 all the way until 2023, just about. And so while that original team of folks is not working together now, the lessons of that work kind of continue on in all different kinds of ways. And the way that it manifested was partnerships with a series of rural elementary schools to try out a whole bunch of different strategies for creating trauma-responsive school cultures, trauma-responsive classroom practices, trauma-responsive relationships with parents and caregivers. And it became like this learning laboratory where the schools were kind of equal partners with us in terms of like, and we had very, very, very game teachers, I should say this, who were helping us to kind of pilot these practices, collect data on them in real time, in very quick cycles, and then scale up the things that were working and like get sunset the stuff that didn't feel like it was a good fit. And so out of that, we we ran the Transforming Rural Experience in Education program, which was the sort of signature program of that partnership, for 3 years. And out of that, there were a couple of sort of key learnings. So one was, that getting schools ready to implement this work, particularly rural schools, meant you had to find these high visibility, low effort wins in the beginning. And so we categorized a kind of series of practices as falling into that bucket. And that was sort of where schools could start if they really wanted to kind of start down this journey of trauma responsive education in rural communities. And then we built upon that foundation by creating slightly more complex programming as we went along. And so by the end, we had there was like a student voice group that was leading school culture efforts in a lot of these elementary schools. And, we had 5th and 6th grade leadership teams that were doing sort of low-key activism, meeting with teachers to talk about the data from the school climate that they had done, but we saw those as very much the sort of full-fledged implementation. And I think the important thing for schools is, like, most people can't start there. You have to start with like the simpler practices. So, it was a really interesting project from the perspective of learning what schools have the capacity to take on, the ways in which COVID contracted that, and now in the post-COVID moment that we're in, trying to figure out how to expand that appetite for innovation again, even in the context of what we know are even more challenging circumstances than maybe we were facing before that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And exciting work. Kat, I want to shift a little bit and talk about youth aspirations and outmigration, because there is a lot of talk, especially when you're looking at seniors and their choices ahead of them, whether they're going to stay in the community or they're going to go to college or they're going to go into the world of work. And can you talk a little bit about what you've learned about why rural youth stay or go, and what parts of that equation that schools can realistically influence? You talked about, what are the boundaries and what are their expectations of influence, and this is certainly one of those areas. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I've been lucky enough to partner with an organization here in Maine that just does really fantastic work in partnership with schools called the Rural Aspirations Project. And it's run by a woman named 𝐄𝐩𝐢𝐬𝐬 and another woman named Val Peacock. And the two of them, they're a tiny organization, but they do probably what I think is the most impactful kind of strategic planning work with schools that I've ever seen. And a lot of it in the past decade or so has revolved around the idea of portrait of a graduate. And so as part of that, I have been they pulled me in to talk to some school boards and community groups about what's reasonable to expect, really, when we're talking about high schoolers who are thinking about their post-secondary trajectory. And my message for them is always, folks who are at the age where they are making these decisions are among the most mobile demographic that exists across the lifespan. And so it's not very reasonable to expect that students are going to move from high school into a stable position within the community or straight into a career in the community anymore. And that is such a shift, a mindset shift, right, for so many rural communities, especially here in Maine, where we've had, some real legacy industries that have kind of sustained some of our communities for a long time, and that's changing now. So really what we're talking about when we're talking about post-secondary trajectories is we're talking about coming back. And the ways that we get students or young people to think about coming back to the places that they are is to give them great experiences with their local school so that they want their kids to have similarly great experiences in that community, which means setting up a strong ecology for youth development in the community, right? Where kids are known by multiple adults outside of the home for more than just their name. Maybe they, where they have relationships with lots of different people. They have relationships with lots of different places in the community. And it also means really investing in school quality proactively. And I think that's a hard message for a lot of communities because of the demographic change that they're experiencing. They have smaller tax bases than they're used to. They have more older residents than they've used to. And so sometimes it means really like thinking outside the box. Like if we want young people to move back to our communities, then we need to get our older residents engaged with the schools so that they want to vote for the budget. Just sort of like that way of thinking. And so it's more than just really thinking about youth aspirations. It's thinking about a community's aspirations for itself, and really getting every resident in the community engaged in that vision.
Can you talk about the origin story of that resilience work and what are the core moves that leaders should know about if they want to build staying power?
So the Rural Educator Resilience Project started with a congressionally directed allocation of funds, courtesy of Senator Angus King and Senator Susan Collins, and that was received by UMaine in April of 2024. And the original proposal was to put together some kind of networked improvement community or network-based support for early career teachers, mid-career teachers, and early career principals. And the idea behind that was to really make sure that we were building a pipeline that would get folks from the moment that they graduate from their teacher preparation program all the way through their first foray into the world of school leadership. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting in building this program is, we had a couple of ideas about how this was going to work when we went into it, and how we were going to sustain this at the statewide level that have been, I think, displaced with better ideas that came from our partners, the teachers. And so it's always a good lesson for me every single time I do this work that we have to go in ready to listen. We have to go in with a design mentality. Like even if we've proposed something that's written in stone for some kind of grid program as a university, we just don't know like exactly what it is that teachers want and is going to be most useful. And so now that we had the funds, we were like, we've got to design something that meets their needs. So we brought in 25 rural teacher leaders in the first 6 months to co-design the project with us. And that one of the first things they said to us was like, it's great that you want us all to meet online, but like we do so much online. We want to meet in person. And so that was like the very first design challenge that we had to overcome was how do we make a program that's sustainable, that still meets the needs of folks to get together in person and to get out of their schools, because that was what teachers were clamoring for. They were like, we want to see what other schools are doing. And it's not just that we want to see what other schools are doing. We want to see what other schools are doing well. And schools that look like us and feel like us. And so one of the very first things that we did was start what we call 𝐄𝐥𝐻𝐬𝐬𝐸 days. So 𝐄𝐥𝐻𝐬𝐬𝐸 is the Maine state motto. It means I lead. And so we thought it was appropriate for the teacher leader strand, which was the first strand that we launched. And we would bring groups of teachers to a rural school that, like, by all metrics was doing really innovative things. And for Maine, a lot of that innovation right now really revolves around getting outside and connecting social emotional learning to the outdoors in different kinds of ways, and also connecting the curriculum to the outdoors in different kinds of ways. Because as a rural tourism-based economy, we have a lot to offer our kids, but so many of them can't access the outdoors for so many different kinds of reasons. So there are some schools that are doing this really well. And it's an easy innovation to transfer across rural communities. And so that was our first trip, was to a school that East Grand School in Danforth, Maine, which is right up on the Canadian border, a tiny school of 120 students, K-12. But they are doing really, really innovative, cool things with outdoor learning and working it into the curriculum all the way from kindergarten to the 12th grade. And so one of the things so the teacher leaders who spent time in the classrooms then went back to their own schools and have done such incredible and interesting work leveraging what they saw for their own school's benefit. So we have a school in Mid-Coast, Maine, which is about 4 hours south of Danforth now, that was able over the summer to rework their master schedule so that they can have an outdoor learning block, for example, because of this. And that I don't know if that would have happened otherwise. But it gave the teachers who saw this the leverage and motivation and the example that they needed to go to their administration and say, this is possible. So that's one of the things that we've been doing. Another is we were extremely inspired by the cool work that Jane Downey is doing in Montana through the Mentor Montana program. And so we've tried to replicate pieces of that here with our early career teacher program. And so we've got teachers in rural districts mentoring teachers in other rural districts, so cross-district mentorship, who are in the same grade level and subject area. At the moment, we're not in a place where we're fulfilling the Maine state mentorship requirements through doing that. This is more of a supplemental program, but one of our goals for next year is to align it with those so that it can do both. And so we're really excited about that. And then, of course, we have our leader in residence has been doing a community of practice with early career principals, and then also early career superintendents. And we didn't set out to do that. But one of the things that became apparent right away was when we started to look around, the superintendents were saying, well, this is so great for my early career principals, but where's the support for me? And so we were like, okay, well, we can't leave you out. We've got to get everybody.
If the state of Maine could pull one policy lever next to support the things that you're doing, what would you recommend to them?
That's such a good question. I think the place that we're all afraid to go is the statewide teacher contract. But I also feel that equalizing teacher pay across districts in Maine would do so much for the state, or even just raising teacher pay. We're not competitive when you look at our border states. And that is, I think, one of the most challenging policy issues that our schools are facing in terms of competing with Massachusetts and New Hampshire for teachers. And it's even the folks that graduate from our University of Maine teacher preparation program, in a survey, 70% of them said that they weren't interested in a rural district placement, which is really a problem in a state like Maine where 60% of our districts are rural.
Yeah.
We're working to change that.
There's a program called Rural Thrive. Can you describe what that is and then talk about the gaps? You talked about teachers. What are the gaps that Rural Thrive is closing for those teachers?
So the program that I just described is the Rural Thrive program. And so it's in that sense, what it's doing is connecting teachers with folks who are either in a position to mentor them or are in a role-alike position in a way that overcomes the sort of inherent isolation that a lot of professionals working in rural schools feel just by nature of the fact that they're the only at the grade level or only in their subject area. And, I always say there are so many great things about working in rural schools, but the isolation is one of the challenges that we have to overcome. And so we need to plan and design for that rather than expecting teachers to ameliorate it themselves, because they don't have time for that.
Definitely. No, they don't. From your case study about the Rural Aspirations project, what did long-running redesign efforts get right about change management in small schools?
Well, I think that one of the things that I've learned from watching the Rural Aspirations project at work over the last decade is that it's not just that they provide high quality curricular supports to districts that don't have curriculum coordinators, for example, which is something that is very common here in Maine, right? So they are kind of contracted curriculum coordinators in that sense. But they do so much more. And I think the way that I describe it is they are the capacity extension that I always say that schools try to push innovation out. And they don't do it on purpose. They do it. It's just by virtue of the rigidity of the structures that most schools have in place and need to maintain in order to continue to function. Anything that disrupts those structures is kind of naturally sort of titrated out. And one of the things that an outside organization, like an external partner, Rural Aspirations being a good example, can do is hold that innovation when the school is trying to push it out and keep pushing it back in. And so when there's leadership turnover, when there's staff turnover, when schools are not able to find time to continue to work on something, or when the inevitable crisis happens, they are able to bring the innovation back to the table over and over and over and over again, such that it gets farther and farther away from falling off the table or being the first thing to fall off the table when everything goes crazy, which schools are constantly crazy, right? And so and that to me is the biggest difference between an organization that really sparks change and then leaves, and an organization that partners in the long term and sustains change, is that's one of their key roles, is continuing to bring this back. And they have to do it at multiple levels, and they have to be prepared to work at multiple levels. So they have to get comfortable speaking the language of administration, and they have to get comfortable working at the classroom level. And they have to get comfortable working directly with the kids. They can't do one of these things. It has to be all three.
What's a routine that a principal could adopt, though, without new funding that would make this run?
Oh, so one of the things that they've done is co-plan all the professional development for the teachers with the outside organization. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about Rural Aspirations is that they often start their work by co-writing a grant with a school district. But then the work that they do is so valuable that the school board puts it into the base budget. And so I think being willing to make time to sit with a partner, and I know how valuable that time is for principals, right? They don't just have time where they can sit down and ideate. That's not a thing. But if you have a partner that is good, and this is what I would say to the partners, is be good at the ideation and follow through on the things that you say you're going to do, so that you're not putting the burden on the principal to be the driver, but that you're really listening to them and meeting some organizational need that they have through the work that you're doing, not an add-on. And so I think making that time is costly in the sense that, I had a student who wrote her dissertation on the work conflicts that are experienced by rural principals as opposed to the work-life conflicts. There's so much different kinds of work that you could do that the work is conflicting with the work itself. So I know that there's that opportunity cost to do that, but that I think is the low cost thing, is to trust the partner and I think there are early things you can do that will assess whether they're going to be a good partner for you. Do they listen in that first meeting? Are they interested in your goals for the school? Are they pushing a curriculum and something that's going to require fidelity? Or are they saying, how can we make this work for you?
Was there ever a concern, Kat, about protecting community identity while making those changes?
What an interesting question. I do think that questions of community identity come up here in this work in Maine. But often it's around, it comes up in places where the community has not considered what its future is going to look like. That where there isn't a coherent idea about whether we're going to be a retirement destination or whether we're going to unincorporate in a decade or whether we're going to be a place for tourism or, so much of it is tied to that long-term economic trajectory of that place. And I find that the community identity pieces mostly come up into like people either not wanting to have that conversation or having unrealistic expectations about what that conversation should sound like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. That's interesting. Because change has a way of bringing those kinds of things to the surface. And I wondered what you were saying in Maine. I want to slightly shift to the teacher shortage and what it looks like on the ground in your state. Talk to me about what districts are finding as far as leverage points despite, thin staffing or long travel distance. I know that there's geography plays a part of that teacher shortage in Maine. Can you talk a little bit about what your state is seeing and then what they're doing to address those issues?
Yeah, I mean, we see the same shortage areas that I think rural states all over the country see. We have very few STEM educators at all levels. It's the pay is not competitive for folks that are interested in going into STEM. World language is a place where we really struggle. Math, I'm trying to think. I think I would say that all the shortage areas that you would expect to see are artifacts of what we see here in Maine. I think in terms of addressing strategies that districts are using to try to address this, there are a couple of really interesting things that are happening. So one is we've got a number of efforts that are trying to move paraprofessionals into teaching roles in different kinds of ways, which I think is a great strategy on so many levels, like meeting people where they are, letting them work while they get their credential, is so important. And ed techs in particular, that's what we call them here in Maine, are so knowledgeable when it comes to the local community and when it comes to student behavior. They often bring a wealth of experience that like folks graduating from a traditional teacher preparation program don't bring. And so that, I think, when you combine that theory and practice together, you get some of the best educators around. So there are a number of programs that are supporting folks in doing like flexible coursework. So the University of Maine at Presque Isle has like a fully self-paced curriculum that people can do as working professionals. There are also some really interesting partnerships. So one of them is like the Educator's Accelerators program is a partnership between the UMaine Teacher Preparation Program and one of the local districts here, where teachers, our student teachers, can work for the district full-time as paraprofessionals. And then they get teaching experience as substitutes while they're in building, and they get paid for that while they're also completing their student teaching. So that's a different model than the one that our traditional teacher preparation program employs, and has been very popular. I know that other campuses in the state are also doing really cool and interesting things, but I don't know as much about them.
Are you seeing the leadership pipeline also being impacted in Maine? And have you seen turnover in leadership positions like the superintendency or the principalship?
It is something that we're very concerned about. So our leader in residence, as part of the Rural Educator Resilience Project, Paul Austin, is a former superintendent. He has his PhD from the University of Southern Maine, and he's been leading the most recent data collection round for the Maine Principal and Superintendent Survey, which is a 30-year longitudinal data collection effort. And one of the things that he's found in this most recent round of data collection is that principals are not spending more time on the job, but that the demands of the job are so much more intense than they were when they were reporting their time use 30 years ago. So we see a big difference in terms of the intensity of how they're spending their time, which obviously contributes to burnout. The other thing is that most of the principals that we surveyed do not want to become superintendents. And that's very concerning to us because when we look at the Maine Superintendent Survey, most of the superintendents are near retirement age and are really looking forward to retirement. We have I don't know if this is true in Arizona, but we have a history of just not letting superintendents retire in Maine. Like they try to retire and then we say, no, why don't you come back and do another interim position? Or could you do this interim position over here too? Or maybe this one up here? We're not going to be able to run that strategy forever. So it's definitely something we're very concerned about.
Go ahead, finish your thought. It's definitely.
Oh, I was just saying that it's definitely something we're concerned about. And it's actually, we are, it's a special project that Paul is going to be taking on over the course of the next year, is like really looking at working with the professional organizations in the state to think about how we, how as a leader preparation program, we can be a better partner to some of the districts in the state in thinking about this.
You mentioned CAT partnerships, and I want to jump into that because the community anchors that exist beyond the school are so important. Can you talk about where libraries or health clinics or local employers have really acted as co-educators, and what is it about the partnerships that you're seeing in Maine that make them durable?
Well, I think that they're in the places that are doing the most interesting and innovative work, connecting the kind of isolated pieces of different community ecologies together. So like our health clinics, our schools, our, recovery services, our social work services, et cetera. I think there's usually some kind of backbone organization that is facilitating that connection. And it would be so wonderful if these things could just happen organically. And I think as humans, we assume that they can happen organically, but that hasn't been my experience. My experience has been that it takes a concerted visioning effort. It takes some coalition of the willing to try to bring people together and build these relationships across different sectors. Because again, it gets back to that when you're in a stressful, human situation, right? You're like, well, what can I control and what can I not control? And I'm just going to focus on the things that I can control. And in isolation, that is a strategy that makes a lot of sense. But when it comes to working with other people, we have to think bigger. And so one of the things that I find is that these backbone organizations do a good job of helping people set aside that learned helplessness and that kind of finger pointing that can happen or that can like grow over time, these little petty resentments between organizations. Because like, let's be real, like in tight social networks, that happens. And so there's some repair work that needs to happen there, or, dialogue is just such an important part of being able to coordinate these services. And I think we would all love for it to just be like, oh, well, if the services exist, people will find them in isolation, but that's just not the case. There has to be somebody who is doing that warm handoff work.
No, you nailed it. So you are a researcher, and I want to have you look ahead in the next 3 or 5 or 10 years and talk about what the priorities are that should really guide rural education research. What is it that you see on the horizon? And then additionally, what is it that district leaders actually need from scholars?
Well, I would love for district leaders to tell me that. I don't feel in any position to tell district leaders what I can. I think one of the things I always try to bring to those conversations actually is like, here are some of the skills I can offer you. You tell me what the issues are that you need those skills applied to. But I think, I have a little bit of a perspective on this because of the work that the Higher Education Committee for NREA did on the National Rural Education Association research priorities. And I was lucky enough to be part of the team that kind of did the survey and the qualitative work to put that together. Although, we've been thinking a lot about what the next round of data collection is going to look like and how we're going to elicit those ideas from people. So I'm excited about the idea of launching a survey in the new year that kind of gets at some of these issues. I think it's really easy to look at the news and say, well, the political pressure that districts are under is going to be one of the top priorities. But I'm hesitant to say that because, we did the data collection for the last National Rural Education Association research priorities just post-COVID. And we expected that COVID was going to be like a high research priority, and it wasn't. Like that was not, it was the same things that we have consistently seen be raised over time, right? Rural teacher recruitment and retention, youth aspirations, community partnerships and well-being, like all of the things that we've been talking about for decades upon decades. And yes, I think that the issues are nuanced different ways and different political moments, but from my perspective, what it all really comes down to is a fundamental mismatch between the kind of modern school system and what rural communities actually need. And that if rural schools were allowed to redesign their schools from the ground up with their communities in mind, I think schooling would look really different than the way that it actually does. And so we're dealing with that imperfection all the time. And that's where I think, these needed priorities come out of. The one thing that I will say is, one of the things we heard in the last set of data collection was that people wanted case studies of high quality rural innovation. And that's what that is, if I had a preference as a researcher, that's what I would want to see coming out in the next 2 to 3 years is really high quality, detailed case studies of things that are working. I think we know what the problems are. What we don't know is how to solve them all the time.
Good point. And to go back to something that you said about having district leaders actually work with scholars in order to get that research off the ground. How would you suggest that a district co-design a study so that the findings that are being generated are immediately usable?
Well, I think that there's a reality that all research practice partnerships have to grapple with, which is that there are two audiences that need to benefit from the work that's being done. So one is the practitioners need actionable strategies that they can apply tomorrow, and really thinking about what that means. What does it mean to produce knowledge that can be applied tomorrow? Because that's a very different task than producing knowledge that is going to go under peer review and take 2 years to come out and may not even be super relevant by the time that it reaches a public audience. And so recognizing that those are two very different timetables, and approaching the project with some flexibility, both as the practitioner and as the researcher, to negotiate how to meet those two very different timetables. Sure. Because one of the things that I found working in research practice partnership is like, I have to turn data around much more quickly than I am used to in a higher education setting. Like, I'm used to sitting with it and marinating with it and really thinking deeply about it, but that's not going to work for my district partners. They need the results like yesterday. And not just the results, but what are my recommendations and implications? And so I think being able to set up a framework that lets you process data together, and generate those actionable insights on the short term, figure out what the media is for distributing those actionable insights in a timely way to the people that need to hear them. And then also, and this is the part that I think sometimes the practitioners have a hard time with, giving researchers the space periodically to do that deeper thinking and work. And it has to alternate between the both. It can't just be one and it can't just be the other.
Yeah, good point. Kat, as a researcher, you've warned against either or traps in rural research. So can you talk a little bit about how that lens can possibly change improvement work on the ground, or what you recommend as a result of?
Yeah, this is something that I started to think a lot about when I was an early career researcher who I felt so trapped by the kind of challenge of framing problems that rural communities were facing without saying that rural communities were the problem. And that was such a hard line to walk. And I think a lot of people find that to be a hard line to walk. And it's one of the reasons I think it's so important to kind of tease out is because we have so much in the public discourse that is about how rural communities are deficient, or rural people are dumb, or rural people are backwards. And that is like, we have inherited this narrative that is so toxic, and not true. But at the same time, like, for example, the isolation that I was talking about that people participating in the Rural Educator Resilience Project experience, that's real. And this is just as true when we talk about things like, healing-centered ecologies at school or something like that, right? Like, we have, like, adverse experiences happen all the time to kids, and we need to find a way to think about the environment that the kids are in without saying that the kids themselves are the problem. So we're used to doing this kind of mental, reframe when it comes to working with the kids who are in front of us. I think most educators are pretty good at separating out, like, the kid from the behavior. But I don't think that we necessarily always apply that consistently when it comes to rural communities. And part of that is because we don't tell a coherent narrative about the resilience and adaptation of rural communities over the past, I always look at 100 years, but over the past century. Like, there's so much that's changed. There's so much that's changed about the structure of rural life. And yet we love to point at rural people and say, well, you haven't done enough, or the reason that these things have happened is because of some internal deficiency in you. And so I was looking for a way out of that trap. And I think I found it in the sense of, like, rural strength, right? You can look at rural strengths and still understand that there are challenges present within it.
I love that. That's a great way to frame it. So, Kat, what's next for you? What's next on the docket? A study or a partnership that you're excited about in the year ahead?
Oh, well, I have two projects that I'm really excited about. So one is in process right now. I've been working with Dr. Karen Epley at Kansas State University on a study looking at how schools can become more recovery-friendly institutions. And part of the impetus for this work really grew out of the community-based work that we were doing in northern Maine, where communities that are just heavily impacted by opioid use, a lot of folks struggling through substance use disorder in different kinds of ways, and many, many, many affected others in the community, right? And thinking about the experience of those parents and what they were telling us about coming to the school to access services and feeling the judgment of accessing services at the school site, of having their, trips to the food pantry be surveyed in different kinds of ways, or their trips to the health clinic be surveyed. And feeling like even if they were, fully on a recovery journey, for example, they still felt like people were looking at them askance. And in a small community, that's enough to discourage people from accessing those services. And so it was a part of school-based community health centers and school-based community services that I had not thought about. Because I thought of the school, as an educator, think of the school as a welcoming place, a neutral place. And so I was like, okay, well, I want to understand this better. And that led Karen and I to the research on recovery-friendly workplaces and recovery-friendly schools. But it's been really interesting because, we have school administrators say, look, we don't have the budget for parent problems here. Like that's beyond the scope of what we can do. And again, it's that bright lining of the distinction of what can I control, what can I control. And so we're like, okay, well, what would have to shift that perspective? Like what would community organizations have to do? What kind of training would people need? That kind of thing. So that's one thing I'm working on. And then the other is, we just got a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and Kathleen Gillen, who's my colleague in higher education here, is the PI, looking at the role of legacy economies in young people's post-secondary decisions. So we're going to look at a fishing community, a forested community, a tourism community, and an agricultural community, and really think about how are young people's decisions about post-secondary different, or are they the same across these different single, legacy economies.
You're going to have to come back for both of those things and tell us what you found. They sound really interesting.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm super excited about it.
So, Kat, I always ask the same question to end our time together, and that is, what does the term rural advantage mean to you?
Oh, so much. So one of the things that I think about is going to the local elementary school here. I have a son who's 9. And when I go to the concert at the end of any given semester and I look up at the stage, there's about, maybe 45 kids in the 4th and 5th grades, who are up on the stage singing together. And I know every single one of those kids. I know their names. I know their parents. I know, and I am personally invested in every single dance move that each of those kids is making, whether they're doing the most or whether they are shy and I can tell that they don't really want to be up there. And the fact that I can say that, and I know that that's true of other adults in the audience who are looking at my kid, that to me is the rural advantage, of being known and being seen. And sometimes being seen is hard, but I think I love living in a small community where people know one another, where conflict is resolved at the human level, and where I actually believe that people working together can make a difference for other people who are in our community. And I think that that has not always been true every single place that I've lived, particularly bigger places. And so, I'm sure there are lots of people that would answer this question and say, it's the outdoors, it's this, that, and the other thing. I'm kind of an indoor cat myself. But for me, that is how rural advantage shows up in my life.
I love that answer. Thanks for sharing that. So, Kat, I want to thank you for coming on and grounding us in evidence that really does serve real people, and for showing how research really becomes better schedules or smarter partnerships or stronger schools without losing the heart of a community. And I appreciate that your clarity on youth voice and mental health supports and redesign that really honors the local identity and gives leaders something solid to carry forward. So thanks a lot for spending some time with me today.
No, thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
Well, friends, if this conversation has sparked an idea, bring it to your next cabinet huddle or community coffee and invite partners to shape it with you. If the Rural Scoop is helping you lead with purpose, please like the episode and subscribe to the show and leave a comment with your takeaway. Share it with a colleague who cares about rural schools, because those signals help other people find us, and I read every note. I'm your host, Melissa Sadorf, and remember, in rural leadership, our strength is our shared story. When we lead together, we thrive together. I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Rural Scoop. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these important rural conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment or share your thoughts. You can follow along and never miss a new release by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or by following us on social. We're on YouTube at The Rural Scoop, Instagram at msadorf1, and X at msadorf03. The Rural Scoop is produced with support from Vela Educational Consultants. To learn more, visit velaconsultants.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education. And as always, keep leaning in to the rural advantage.